everyone, and welcome back to Todos Santos. This week we are returning to our regularly scheduled programming, and we're going to be doing something a little bit simpler than what we did the last few episodes. Well, that was my intention, at least. So there's been something that's been bugging me for quite a while in this city, and it's that the island, one of the most important parts of the city, which houses the old town, the cruise docks, and plenty of other interesting and important aspects of the city, has a completely bare northern shore. So today we're going to be remedying that. I thought it would be a nice simple build, but I'll just tell you that my first cut of this episode was about an hour and 20 minutes long, and I have to say I'm pretty proud of myself that I managed to cut it down to only half an hour. So I hope that you'll stick with me as we work on this area and make it nice and beautiful and very accessible via trams. But first, I wanted to deal with this intersection here. Now, I mentioned quite a while ago in the series that I was having some traffic problems, and part of that is due to this, because all the traffic that goes to the island comes through this intersection, where the main freeway terminates and just turns into a normal service road. So what I wanted to do is add one last freeway exit here that enters into this roundabout, just to separate the intersection of that traffic from the main road over to this roundabout, which is going to be able to handle the traffic much more easily. So I basically just turned the terminus of the freeway there into a bridge, put a little side road that runs underneath it to access the roundabout so that through traffic can still cross over. And then anyone who wants to turn right here, which is quite a lot of people, because they're going to be going to this transit station here on the left, they're going to be going down the road that we're making this episode, which is going to have trams as well. Basically, this whole area is going to take all those cars and get them right off the freeway instead of having them turn at that main intersection there. It does help somewhat to alleviate the traffic jam. Of course, to some degree, you can only move the traffic jam, but hopefully it's going to be enough that it's just going to stop driving me crazy seeing all these cars backed up here. Now, to complement this roundabout, I wanted to have kind of a simple one-way road system that goes through this area just to force the cars to take certain routes, because when I had a two-way road system, there ended up being a lot of mini traffic jams throughout this area where people are trying to do turns in weird places. So I just wanted to force them to take the roundabout if they want to get through this area instead of kind of trying to cheat by going through roads that they're not really meant to go through. Now here, there are lots of buses that cross this area here, so I wanted to have a little bit of a bus lane right next to this transit station. So I'm just doing what is now the classic IMT bus lane with some white lines on the outside and a dark red solid filler. And that just basically gives the buses here a free pass to get through this intersection without having to worry about any traffic jams. Now for the transit station itself, it's kind of just a placeholder. I haven't actually detailed it yet. That's going to get its own episode, I think, in the future. Haven't actually done the build yet, so we'll see. Now, having adjusted this intersection here, there was a little bit of space left, so I wanted to put in some of these more recent buildings. Most of the development on the island here was done off camera with old buildings a long time ago, so it's not very good. And a good portion of this episode is actually going to be dedicated to redeveloping some of the island area, so you'll get to see that later on as well. And because we're in one of the oldest areas of the city, I wanted to have a variety of buildings, so it looks like some of them might have been there from the early 20th century, and some of the other ones are a lot more recent, and so there's a mix of styles. Okay, now we're pretty much done with this area, so we're going to start on the trams. I had a lot of false starts with this episode. Like that roundabout we built, I had tried 3 or 4 different methods of dealing with that intersection, and it was largely the same with this tram road. So I'm just showing you my first attempt here, which was to have basically a road down at sea level. I was going to do all kinds of different development down here, thinking that it would be a more recent development. By the way, here is the first tram asset of the 2 options that I found, and here's the second. I end up going with this one, the longer one. I actually overall prefer the first asset, but this one just had, I think, the sort of look I'm going for. And while I was at it, I also replaced the city's main light rail vehicles. I think this one just looks a little bit more substantial. Anyway, I'm going to scrap that first idea, and we're going to try something a little bit different. So let's get started on that by deleting everything that we've just done. Well, just the tram road, actually. The roundabout and everything is staying. But basically what I do is I realize that I already have this perfectly good road here, and I think it would be cool to have it kind of up on a cliff. because as far as I can tell, in San Juan, the northern shore of the island here is a little bit of a cliff. It's fairly rocky, and the beaches are not quite as accessible as elsewhere in the city. So I wanted to kind of go with that aesthetic. So I pushed the shoreline back here a little bit, just so we can have the cliffs look a little bit more imposing instead of going down to this nice, pretty, and flat beach. And then over the course of the episode, we're going to decorate this to make it look nice and wild and undeveloped for the most part. I mean, there'll be some development along this road, but not too much. Anyway, I'm really glad that I did this because before I just was not feeling inspired, and I think having this little bit of a challenge to have this cliff and the hills that lead up to it just really gave me something to bounce ideas off of, I guess. And it just gave me a direction to go in that I didn't have beforehand. Now, when I originally made the Capitol in episode 31, I mentioned that someone thought it would be a good idea to have it be a center for trams. I didn't do that at the time, but now we're doing it. So it's not really a center, it's not a transit station or anything, but we are going to have trams pass through here, which I think looks super, super cool. You'll see that in the cinematics. And then I'm creating the actual line here. I wanted to have the spacing of the stops be somewhere between buses and light rails. So every, 4 to 5 blocks. There aren't really blocks out in this area because of the way the roads are, but just trying to approximate that distance. Now, I'm thinking while I'm at it, I might as well run the tram across the island here too to connect up with the tourist area. I was hesitant to do this at first because I knew I'd have to do all this bulldozing and deleting and everything. And it actually turned out to be fairly easy. There just happened to be a clear path where I could just delete a few things and then run a tram road through here. At first I just do tram tracks, but then I end up coming back in a moment and upgrading the whole thing to a tram road so cars can also use it. Because I figured in this old area of the island, they wouldn't want to dedicate so much of an area just to a rail right-of-way. So they just go with a normal street with tram tracks on it. And one other nice thing about that is that since it's a normal road, we're able to squeeze in a little bit more development along it and make this place feel a little bit denser, which was always my original vision for this area, but it didn't really translate when I initially filled it in for the most part. Anyway, we'll get to that in just a moment, but first I wanted to just drag this line all the way over to the tourist area so it can start carrying people around the island. Now here's what I'm talking about. We have all this space here, so I'm going to just upgrade this to a normal road, and we're going to get going on placing down a few buildings. First though, I wanted to just fill in some of these gaps with trees. As always, I'm a little bit excessive with that, but it's not hurting anyone, so I'm going to continue to do it. Okay, now we're actually going to start putting down a few buildings, and I'm really trying to fill in every nook and cranny with the occasional little bit of green space or blank area that's filled in with trees. And I'm going pretty eclectic. At this point in the series, I am still trying to figure out the sorts of buildings that I want to group together. Placing buildings on this part of the island is really nice because, like I mentioned before, it's one of the oldest parts of the city. So you're going to get a variety of buildings as things have been torn down and rebuilt over the years. So it really gives me a bit of a free pass to be a little bit more random and a little bit less cohesive in terms of styles of architecture. I think this is as good a time as any to just sit back and look at these amazing assets that we are so lucky to have. I'll be back in just a second. Well, I think this area looks much nicer now. Okay, so now we're going over to the terminus of the tram line near the cruise ship port that we made quite a while ago. I'm just adding a little bit of a waiting area where people can sit and hang out and wait for the tram to take their scenic ride along the shoreline. I decided to ditch the pre-made bus stop asset that I used there and ended up making a custom one because I thought it needed something a little bit bigger, a little bit fancier, since this, after all, is going to be one of the main attractions of visiting the island, to ride this tram and see all the historic buildings and that kind of thing. It just has a simple metal awning. I really like this asset. It looks like the sort of thing you see in tropical places and subtropical places. And I just, with that nice weathered look, I just think that really fits in since we're right on the shoreline here. And then for such a busy pedestrian area, I thought it was a little dark, so we're adding some of these lights. These are the zoo lights from the Park Life DLC. I think they're actually really nice asset. I also installed this functional fountain asset. I guess fountains are functional? Can fountains be functional? I don't know. Anyway, look at that. Pretty cool. Okay, now we're heading back and we're going to be focusing on the actual shoreline of the island. Just doing some development, much like what we did redeveloping that area before, except we're just doing it now and filling in all these gaps between what was previously there and what is now there with the tram road. By the way, this road is pretty cool. It actually has lanes of parking on the middle, which is kind of just, I don't know, it's a little bit different, a little bit interesting, instead of having the usual parking on the edge. So basically what I'm doing is just having a bunch of residential beyond the road, and then on the tram road itself, we'll have a mix of residential and commercial area. And I imagine in real life it would be mixed zoning. So on the first floor, you'd have commercial, and then you'd have apartments above. So we're just going to have to imagine that there are some businesses in here. I don't actually feel like going in and making that a functional thing. I just don't think it would add that much visually. And anyway, this isn't exactly a focal point of the city. So I want it to look nice, but I don't want to go into excruciating detail, which is something that's been known to happen occasionally when you really get sucked into playing this game. So I'm going for a mix of mid and low-rise buildings, a mix of new and old. As you can see there, I had that very modern-looking building there, which kind of sticks out like a sore thumb, but I thought it was kind of cool just to have that mixture like I was talking about before. We're moving on down the road, down the shoreline, just deleting all these kind of random details I had here. I really underestimated how dense I wanted this area to be when I first built it. So now I'm coming in and filling in what once was a forest, and we're just putting in some roads and some houses. I guess that's kind of the story of cities. Didn't really need to say that. I think I've shown you enough development for now, so I'm just going to do a before and after there. And then we're going to move over and add just a couple little details here. I'm going to contradict myself and not remove all the forest here. And I'm just going to say that this lot is for sale. If I'm being honest, I was just tired of putting down buildings, and I wanted to move on to the actual focus of the episode, which is going to be all the details along the shoreline. So everything we're going to be doing from now on in this episode is going to be centered around this building. Very cool asset. It's the Hotel Copacabana, I believe. There's something in San Juan a little bit like this. There's a bike path that runs along the shoreline, and then there's like a little bit of a commercial building that meets up with it. I can't really get a good video of it because it must be a fairly recent development, and it's not really in the satellite imagery on Google Earth. So I can't show you a picture of it, unfortunately, but that's what inspired me to set up this build like I did. I also wanted this to be a functional park, so I do paint the whole beach area and shoreline area as a park, and you might have seen me put down an entrance there next to that hotel building. Now for the path itself, I basically just draw out segments with this campus path, which I think looks like a nice plain path, but it has a few details here and there that make it look a little bit more alive and a little bit more aesthetically pleasing. So I'm just drawing it out segment by segment, trying to match it up with the nodes in the road so that I can make the slopes more easily. And then I'm just curving it to match up with the road, and it's actually a pretty easy process to get two networks to match up. So I'm pretty happy with how that turns out. Now I'm connecting it over with the Plaza of Democracy there that is attached to the Capitol building. I find it very satisfying to have this park run all the way along the shoreline, and I think it looks pretty cool. And I'm also changing the lights here to these very fancy looking Parisian lamps. Obviously I went ahead and did that same process in the other direction, moving away from the hotel, but it wasn't as interesting of a location, and it was basically the exact same build, so I didn't feel the need to show that. Hopefully that's all right. So I'm just building this little loop around that goes around the hotel and the parking lot here, using sharpened corners on the pathway to make it look nice and neat, and then adding this little lookout that's going to look out over the shoreline and the kind of rocky beach that we're going to build. I also wanted to add a few functional park buildings, so we have a cafe, we have some restrooms, and a little gazebo that's going to stick out over the trees that we're going to put down there, which I think is kind of cool. Okay, now we've gotten the main infrastructure, the main bits of the build down. I realize that I need to probably put a wall up to keep people from falling off down this very steep cliff. So I just used this kind of weathered looking wall. I believe it's supposed to be a Brazilian wall, which is kind of cool, but it really fits the theme here. And I'm just doing the exact same thing I did with the path, just lining up the nodes, dragging the nodes over, and then curving all of these to match up with it. This is quite a tedious process because it's a little bit harder to get the nodes and the segments selected with Move It, but it's not that bad, and I finished it pretty quickly. And again, I took that and did the same thing over on the other side, exact same process, and nothing new to see there. So I just cut it out. So I'm going to speed this up, and once we get to the end of the wall here, I sink it down into the ground so it looks like there's this gentle slope at the end. That's just something I like to do. It adds a little bit of variety to the visual here and makes it look a little bit more intentional and fancy, which is what we're going for with this build, I think. So now this intersection needed some work. Obviously, the tram rails are kind of clipping through here. Don't worry about the pavement pieces I put there overlapping with it. I fix that off screen. Just adjusting the crosswalks here to be a little wider because this is supposed to be, somewhat more pedestrian centric because there's this path here and there's a bunch of transit that passes through here. Obviously, there's still the giant parking lot and the big roads that meet up with this one, but that's just the nature of Todos Santos. It's always kind of a back and forth between making things more pedestrian centric and making things more car centric. Now, here's a little microcosm of that. We have bollards to protect the pedestrians. We also are going to put down some of these tactile paving pieces at the crosswalks. And then we're going to go in and decorate the parking lot. To cover up that weird texture glitch there in the road, I just decided to put down some ploppable pavement and make it look like there's a different material that they've used here for the entrance part of the parking lot. So for some reason, they decided to use slabs here in the middle, and then it's just normal paved asphalt over in the actual parking area. And then there's 1 lane for entry and 3 lanes for exit because it meets at the stoplight. So I have a left turn lane, forward lane, and a right turn lane. And since it's just a parking lot, I'm not too worried about there being a traffic jam here because cars aren't actually going to drive into the parking lot for the most part. They're just going to park. And then just one last little bit to try to protect the pedestrians here. We have those signs to tell people that there are people crossing. And then we also have some lights. I imagine that you could, in theory, have those hooked up to the stoplight so that people can cross in timing with the cars. I felt like I wanted some planters here instead of just having this balcony, so I put a few of these. I raise them and lower them just a little bit to prevent them from Z-fighting with the textures, and then just fill them in with a few flowers. Well, now it's finally time to actually fill in the shoreline, and this is going to be a completely natural build. There's going to be rocks and trees and grass and all that stuff you'd expect from a cliff along the beach. So I wanted to really focus on this main area here. This would kind of be more like a hill than a cliff, and this is why they built this area here, because there was more buildable area, and it was just generally cheaper and easier to do. Now, to cover these cliffs with greenery was really tough. So I just looked around a little bit and noticed that when you see trees in this sort of area, they're often, maybe this is just true in general, I don't know, but they seem to be kind of in clusters. So you'll get a cluster of palm trees, then you get a cluster of a different type of trees. You'll just generally have clusters everywhere. So I wanted to go with that, and instead of just kind of evenly distributing all the trees like I usually do. So I have the leafy ones just to kind of serve as coverage, just to cover up the cliff texture and make it look like there's a lot of dense greenery here. And then we have those nice palm tree assets, and we'll have a few acacias as well here and there, just to give that nice canopied look. I also covered the whole area with grass, just to give a nice base, and again, to cover up the bare theme textures, and just make it look a little bit more textured. I need to stop saying the word texture. I also add these mangroves in. Obviously, they're not meant to actually be mangroves here, but I just think they have a nice leafy and vibrant look, so I'm also doing clusters of those. I end up being fairly happy with the result here. It's pretty challenging to actually get realistic distributions of trees, so this is definitely not something I'm going to be doing all over the city, but it's nice to have it for these focus areas, just to have it look a little bit more realistic, and yeah, I think it looks kind of cool from a distance. And then just covering up the transition there with some grass. There's going to be more detail here as well once we start putting down the cliffs and the rocks, because I do want it to be sort of a rocky shoreline, although there will be a few beaches here and there. Now, I tried a bunch of different things to try to get the cliffs look good. What I end up going with is just these giant rock assets that I think are from Park Life. I think I mentioned that in episode 31 when I was building the Capitol, and I did something a little bit like this on the other side of the actual Capitol building. So what I do is just have a few sections of these Unfortunately, they have color variations which can't be changed with the coloring mod. I forget what the name of the mod is. Repaint, I think it's called. So that's definitely annoying, but we're going to be covering it up with a few layers anyway. That's kind of really the theme of this build, is putting down layers and layers and layers so that none of the ugly, weird textures remain. And then I just cover up this very steep part of the cliff with these cliff assets just as a base. They're not very nice on their own, but they work really well to cover up that kind of transition. And then we're putting some of these more detailed rock assets at the bottom just to look like the cliff is just wearing down over time and some of these rocks are falling down. It also just helps to transition between the really big rock assets and the plain shoreline. So like I said, there are going to be a few beaches here, so I bring the land out just a little bit and paint it with some sand and then smooth it out as well. Now, once we're done with this second layer, I guess you could call it, of this shoreline, we're going to come through and use the tree brush mod, or forest brush mod it's called, because it just wouldn't be worth the effort to go through and do that painstaking tree placement that I did near the hotel area. So I just made a brush in the mod that has a mix of all those trees, and I'm just painting where they make sense. Like in the gullies in between the big rock assets, down at the bottom of the rocks where there would actually be soil for them to grow, but then I'm also kind of painting over the rocks in some areas just to give it a little bit more variety and imagining that there would be soil there and not rock. I also have a line of palm trees along the path and the road there, and these I imagine would be purposefully planted there just to beautify the area. I also have these shrubs that I think just look nice, and you can imagine like being next to that and looking at that and just imagining this kind of vast forest area beyond it. Well, it's not really vast, but it might feel that way when you're on the path there looking at it. Also, look at all those people walking along there. I love seeing that. Okay, now we're hopping over toward the side of the shoreline near the Capitol and starting in with some grass. When it's on land, it's going to represent grass, and when it's in the water, it's going to represent seaweed and various other algae. And I think just that little bit of silhouette you get a glimpse of when you look at the water is enough to warrant that kind of detail here. It just really adds some life. And now just doing the usual beach decorations with some seafoam. Let's zoom through that. We've seen that before. I'm being a little bit more careful here than when I made the big tourist beach back in episode 36. I think I learned my lesson from that. Still not perfect, but I think it looks all right. I don't know, I just find placing those really tedious for some reason. But it's worth having them there, even if it's not like the most beautiful decal placement you've ever seen. And now we're hopping back over to the Capitol area, and I wanted to make this place look nice and somewhat realistic. So I have some various heights and colors of grass here just to try to blend everything together. And I'm trying to make it look like there are various entrance lanes to the beach, sort of, that have developed over the years. So maybe there used to be grass all along this area, and then, you know, someone bushwhacked a path through there, and people just started taking that instead of making their own path. So there are a few different ways to get onto the beach. Now, this is something I'm not sure about. Palm trees growing out of sand? Is there, like, dirt underneath that they can grow out of? I don't know. I've seen pictures like that. So I wanted to do that here, and I thought it looked kind of cool and kind of fancy. Now, all these trees along the beach here, I imagine would be purposefully planted there and maintained just to have a nice area right next to the Capitol building. Now, just one last little seating area on one of these hidden beaches here. I don't know how these people actually get here. I guess they could swim or something. Who knows? So I wanted to finish off this build with something a little bit silly. I felt like there needed to be some sort of island or something like that out in the sea here that you could see from the shoreline. And I just have a couple islands here, and then I put, what else? A castle. Why not? I would like to build a few more historic defenses in the city, because in San Juan there are a few different areas that have old Spanish forts. I'd like to do something like that, but I don't have any specific plans. But we do have this little thing. In my fantasy world, it could be a little watchtower that for some reason they felt the need to build out on this remote island that no one would ever want to go out to and carry all these materials out to. But I'm not too worried about the realism of it here. I just felt like doing this. And I think it was actually really beneficial to the city to just do something that where I'm not worried about making it realistic or making it look like anything in particular. Just having a little bit of fun. So there's a little dock that runs out There's this little boat here. Someone lives out here. I don't know who that is or what their story is. Maybe you could come up with that in the comments if you're so inclined. Anyway, he has some piles of stuff here. He has a little fire going. It's a little concerning that he doesn't have an actual roof over his head. So I imagine when it rains here, it's not very pleasant. And obviously there's no garbage service out here, so he just has to throw any trash that he generates over the side of the walls here. He has his little mattress and a little nightstand next to it made out of an old wooden crate. And I guess this castle at one point would have needed a well. Maybe there's some water down there. He could drink that since obviously he's not going to be drinking the seawater. Well, this is all getting a little bit silly, so I think it's time to end the episode. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Todos Santos. As always, I really appreciate your time, and I can't wait to see you on the next one, where we're going to be doing something completely different. Bye-bye.